I am Melita Quinonez. I'm an adjunct professor at Black Hills State University, where I have enjoyed teaching there for the past 2 years. And I'm also a PhD candidate at Liberty University. Black Hills State is located in the United States, in South Dakota. And with that, I will begin. So I am speaking today on the problem with afterwards. It's about transformation in the female pupil. It's Pygmalion and My Fair Lady, which My Fair Lady is the musical adaptation, and these are by George Bernard Shaw. So George Bernard Shaw most certainly found the theme of transformation worthy of ink when he wrote his 1912 play, Pygmalion. I remember my first experience with his work as a little girl, watching the musical My Fair Lady and drawing just myself into this most beautiful, magical world of imagination, a place where my identity had not yet been decided by me or for me, by others, and I could dream of whatever future this open-armed world could hold. I could relate to the plight of Eliza Doolittle, not because I was anything like her at all. Our differences could fill an ocean, and literally an ocean did separate our origin stories. Me, a young, prairie-dwelling, country little bumpkin from one of the least populated states in the United States, where 3.6 million cows roam on acres to spare, and yet the human population is under 1 million. Comparing myself to Shaw's Eliza, this streetwise Cockney queen of the gutter, you can see how few comparisons exist to form a bond, except for one very real and very true human experience, struggle. Not only struggle, but the search for identity. I could relate to her because my youthful eyes demanded answers to all of the closed doors with the labels above them that announced that I wasn't enough. Not enough to enter, but also that these doors were locked to me. Some people spend their whole lives trying to gain entry into those kinds of locked doors. In the story of Pygmalion, we see Professor Higgins, an instructor, dangling some sort of a key to a locked door for the character of Eliza Doolittle, to a world that she never imagined would be possible for her to walk into. There's a moment towards the beginning of Act 3 where Shaw cannot leave the suspense alone any longer, and through the voice of Professor Higgins, his mother, actually, she eloquently chides her arrogant son and his companion by saying, "No, you two infinitely stupid male creatures, the problem of what is to be done with her afterwards." For those unfamiliar with the play Pygmalion, you may recognize the vermilion trope of a female's transformation at the hands of a superior male figure. Professor of linguistics, Henry Higgins, makes a boastful claim to his colleague, Colonel Pickering, that he could pass off a common flower girl from the lower class as a duchess at an embassy ball, simply by giving her elocution lessons. Eliza Doolittle, the common flower girl that he was using as an example, then shows up to his residence the very next day asking for lessons in elocution in exchange for her small but hard-earned wages so that she can get a job selling flowers in a shop rather than on the street corner. Instead of accepting her money, he instead takes on the challenge that her lower class identifier, her Cockney accent, her working class dialect presents, and reestablishes the claim that he previously made to Colonel Pickering by betting that with lessons he could pass her off as a lady at the ball. Looking at this play through a socio-political and feminist perspective, one of the more pressing questions of the story becomes, if the transformation succeeds, to whom should the praise be attributed, as well as the often overlooked problem of creating a new identity and the fallout and confusion that leads the transformed to wonder what is to become of me. These themes of identity, transformation, and class barriers are crucial conversations of intersectional feminism and identity politics that argue the problem with afterwards. Narratives about transformation exist in almost every story in some form or another. In fact, most critics find compelling themes, such as change, identity, and meaning, the primary focus of literary criticism. Viktor E. Frankl said in his book, Man's Search for Meaning, that when we are no longer able to change a situation, we're challenged to change ourselves. In the musical adaptation of Pygmalion, My Fair Lady, the very first song that Liza sings is a dreamlike imagining of what it would be like to extend her class barriers. The song, Wouldn't It Be Lovely, is a simple song in its request, naming what most people consider essentials and not pleasures. The song is, all I want is a room somewhere far away from the cold night air with one enormous chair. Wouldn't it be lovely? Lots of chocolates for me to eat, lots of coal making lots of eat. Warm face, warm hands, warm feet. Oh, wouldn't it be lovely? The Industrial Revolution devoured the lower class. Food, water, and a warm place to rest were luxuries for those who kept the upper class in comfort. Frederick Engels, in his work, The Condition of the Working Class in England in 1844, wrote controversially of the hardships of the Industrial Revolution and what today would seem like reasonable demands. The simple fact hitherto concealed by an overgrowth of ideology that mankind must first of all eat, drink, have shelter and clothing before it can pursue politics, science, art, religion, etc. One unfair bias that was lingering in Europe's society would be that hard work was often seen as a punishment for crimes, or an admission that you were of the lower class citizenship, rather than seeing it as an instrument for class elevation or transformation. During the Industrial Revolution, society was exploitative and did not acknowledge hard work as transformative, but as a means to an end. In a society like that, people were not only discouraged from becoming more, but they were treated as criminals should they try to challenge the assigned status of their unfortunate birthright. This highlights the massive risk that would face Eliza if she were to be discovered as a fake at the embassy ball. The risk for Higgins, however, if he didn't win his bet, would just be a blow to his pride. For Eliza, it could mean prison or even death. Not only was the lower class undervalued, but the judgment of punishment was entirely biased to presume guilt based upon birth, where failure in this venture would be a severe way in which to see the imbalance of fairness. We also see imbalances if this experiment would succeed. For Liza's success would be to elevate herself enough to sell flowers and work in an indoor shop rather than in the cold night air. Success for Higgins was based not in the selflessness of educating someone in need, but rather in accomplishing deception. This leads to the question of what success is defined by. Rather than perhaps some of the other reasons that we create for success, we have to look at some of the more interesting ideas on what the definition is. Orson Swett Martin, he said in An Iron Will, success is not measured by what you accomplish, but by the opposition you have encountered and the courage with which you have maintained the struggle against overwhelming odds. In reviewing the play through an early, more traditional form of feminism, some critics write a scathing review about the misogynistic ideas and outdated constructs of feminine roles. An interesting point that needs mentioning here is that with the passing of nearly 100 years since the writing of this play, male-female relationships are not the only dynamic that this culture was experiencing a significant prejudice with. It's easy enough to compare the modern class struggle with our own, but that would be a considerable misunderstanding of what we experience as more an irritating bias to the experiences of class that Shaw is describing with an outright unfairness that often led to a life or death situation. Considering the struggle Liza would encounter both in class and gender bias, it's important to note that Shaw's leading lady was representing two interlapping groups that need activism. The form of feminism and political criticism that best captures Shaw's intentions is a branch called intersectional feminism. Kimberly Crenshaw, a leading feminist in this movement, said in an interview with Time magazine, "All inequality is not created equal. An intersectional approach shows the way that people's social identities can overlap, creating compounding experiences of discrimination." Through this collaborative form of feminism and identity politics, the ideas of discrimination and class barriers seen in Pygmalion are significant examples of the compounded struggle that women of the lower class represented. We see a variety of progressive ideas lurking or lacking when we delve into the characters that Shaw created. With Mrs. Pierce, the housekeeper, we see an example of a person who, for propriety reasons, insists that Professor Higgins concerns himself more carefully where his association with Liza is concerned, but is also somewhat of a motherly figure to the girl. As housekeeper, she represents the role of a mother that Liza didn't have. For Professor Higgins, we see him consistently discriminating against Liza's birth, status, and sex, but also an imposed judgment of a more personal nature, the kind that deprives a person of dignity and decency, the kind that assumes one's station of poverty as a predisposition to criminal behavior. In the play, Higgins says, "Pay her whatever is necessary, put it down in the housekeeping book. What on earth will she want with money? She'll have her food and her clothes. She'll only drink if you give her money." Then Liza proclaims very abruptly, "You are a brute. It's a lie. Nobody ever saw the sign of liquor on me." Pickering interjects, "Does it occur to you, Higgins, that the girl has some feelings?" Higgins replies, "Oh no, I don't think so. Not any feelings that we need bother about. Have you, Eliza?" And she answers back, "I've got my feelings, same as anyone else." Mrs. Higgins, the professor's mother, is a woman who has drawn conclusions of what the reality of the situation actually is for this girl, a reality of what the upper class would demand and expect of Liza. She proclaims, "You certainly are a pretty pair of babies playing with your live dolls." Higgins replies, "Playing, the hardest job I ever tackled. Make no mistake about that, Mother, but you have no idea how frightfully interesting it is to take a human being and change her into a quite different human being by creating a new speech for her. It's filling up the deepest gulf that separates class from class and soul from soul." Mrs. Higgins does have sympathies, but she misses a fundamental understanding of the idea that Liza's struggle and her working class upbringing can account for some portion of what Mrs. Higgins is accrediting solely to the female constitution. Although she supports the truth that the men of her time often underestimated women's abilities, she could not see that Liza's struggle, due to her lower class, was an asset in her achievement of becoming a lady. Liza worked tirelessly to change her station through rigorous lessons from a strict teacher. In My Fair Lady, the song showing Liza's transformation is towards the end of the story, and Liza has her moment of equality and as an equal attempts to square off with Professor Higgins and sings Without You, where she claims her identity apart from him. The delightful juxtaposition is that now that she's at the end of her need for his teaching, she has won his bet and can cash in her reward for independence. There's no more need for Higgins, and this is where the role of tutor cannot fill the same dynamic of an intimate relationship. This intersecting shift of identity crisis is where we see the professor finally be somewhat vulnerable in his Jekyll and Hyde song of "I've grown accustomed to her face," where one minute he is cursing loudly that he does not need her, and the next singing poetically of the niceties of having a woman in his life, which incidentally was in complete juxtaposition of his first song in the musical I'm an Ordinary Man, where he had proudly proclaimed, "I will never let a woman in my life." How Higgins treats Liza is a strange combination of irony, humor, prejudice that parallel what Linda Mugglestone says about Shaw's upbringing in upper-class society and his eventual turning to socialism set in a tone in his work. In the writing of Pygmalion and in the treating of social illusion and social reality, Shaw produces a text which combines the seemingly divergent spheres of socialist parable and social comedy of manners. Shaw's characters share similar conflicts with themselves and the world around them. This conflict is seen explicitly in Higgins and is aggressive displayed towards the end of the play in the book East of Eden by John Steinbeck. We see some of Higgins' struggle with coming to terms with his approach to relationships. When a man comes to die, no matter what his talents and influence and genius, if he dies unloved, his life must be a failure to him, and his dying a cold horror. This creates the question of whether Liza's finding identity outside of Higgins and her leaving was a sort of death for Higgins, or was her independence progress? And if so, doesn't progress suggest that learning is still in session? When Liza proclaims her independence at the end of Pygmalion, Higgins is still fighting to keep his role alive. It is my conclusion and belief that the reason Shaw's characters didn't factor in the momentum that transformation creates is because identity isn't a fixed outcome. For bettering ourselves isn't a goal that we achieve and then cast off. Realistically, and as many teachers know from experience, dependence on one another shifts, and our roles can develop into other unique manifestations. For a teacher, the student learning all that can be taught signals the end of one journey, but what Higgins was unaware of is that Liza's independence signaled the end of their time, due not to the ending of his instruction, instead due to him treating that relationship with contempt. He was from the beginning trying to solve her identity problem by assigning value to her through elocution, but her value was never a problem to be fixed. Due to their conditioning, Shaw's characters could not have known anything other than a value system based on birthright, manners, and other such conditional attributes. But what the upper class unwittingly gets right out of their arrogance over the war over birthright is that people should not have to prove their worth or value. What they get wrong is that this applies to all people. The misconception of our judging human value ultimately ties into our identity. In Liza's case, when she started to see herself as a valuable person, worthy of being treated with respect, it was because Colonel Pickering didn't disqualify her identity as a lady by her lack of value as a lower class citizen. She begins to experience a revelation of value, and as a result, her confidence in a ladylike identity blossoms. She speaks to Colonel Pickering in this section, and she says that it was just like learning to dance in the fashionable way. There was nothing more than that in it. But do you know what began my real education? What? You're calling me Miss Doolittle that day when I first came to Wimpole Street. That was the beginning of self-respect for me. And there were 100 little things that you never noticed because they came naturally to you. Things about standing up, taking off your hat, and opening doors. Oh, that was nothing. Yes, things that showed you thought and felt about me as if I were something better than a scullery maid. Though of course I know you would have been just the same to a scullery maid if she had been let in the drawing room. You never took off your boots in the dining room when I was there. You mustn't mind that. Higgins takes off his boots all over the place. I know, I'm not blaming him. It is his way, isn't it? But it made such a difference to me that you didn't do it. You see, really and truly, apart from the things that anyone can pick up, the dressing, the proper way of speaking, and so on, the difference between a lady and a flower girl is not how she behaves, but how she is treated. Higgins struggled to cope with her identity. And as an independent lady, due to this devaluation of her and his false belief that identity rather than value is the foundational element, value is fixed, where identity is something we already are and yet are becoming. Identity is not fixed. No, it is found in unity with the idea of recognition. As Liza was already in the habit of becoming, of progressing, and of transforming, It was a deflating and frustrating experience at the end when everyone else thought that it was all done for her to transform any further. Yet for her, it was not enough to stop there. She was angry, and now she was on this progressive train that by worldly standards only went one direction, but had stopped in a station that she was unaccustomed to. And now what's to become of her? Perhaps Mrs. Higgins, Henry's mother, was the only one who had the right question all along. Be quiet, Henry. Colonel Pickering, don't you realize that when Eliza walked into Wimpole Street, something else walked in with her? Her father did, but Henry soon got rid of him. It would have been more to the point if her mother had, but as her mother didn't, something else did. Pickering asks, but what? A problem. Oh, I see the problem of how to pass her off as a lady. Higgins then responds, I'll solve that problem. I've half solved it already. Mrs. Higgins proclaims, no, you two infinitely stupid male creatures, the problem of what is to be done with her afterwards. Thank you all.